Good evening, I'm Nima, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, November 30th. We begin tonight with federal reaction to the new Alberta Sovereignty with a United Canada Act. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he's not looking for a fight with Alberta, but he says nothing is off the table when it comes to responding to the act. New Premier Danielle Smith introduced the act yesterday, giving her government broad powers. Mr. Trudeau says the new legislation is raising eyebrows even in Alberta. The bill proposes to give Ms. Smith's cabinet the power to rewrite provincial laws without legislative debate. She characterizes the bill as a way to push back against Ottawa. Meanwhile, Alberta's former premier has resigned his seat in the legislature. Jason Kenney tweeted his resignation letter after Danielle Smith's government introduced the sovereignty bill in the throne speech. Mr. Kenney said he is leaving his government seat and that representing the riding of Calgary-Lougheed since 2017 has been a privilege. He praised how matters are dealt with under Canada's constitutional monarchy, but he expressed concern that democracy is veering towards a polarization that undermines bedrock institutions and principles. All right, switching gears to the latest batch of 2021 census data, which indicates that Canada is continuing to lead G7 countries when it comes to having the most educated workforce. Just over 57% of Canadian workers between the ages of 25 to 64 have a college or university education. Now, this is thanks to a strong college sector and highly educated immigrants. Statistics Canada says almost 1 in 4 working-age people had a college certificate, diploma, or similar credential in 2021. This is more than any other G7 country. Almost 1/3 of the working-age population reported having a bachelor's degree or higher in 2021, which is up 4.3% since 2016. All right, we'll also include it in the census information released today. Statistics Canada says there were 2.8 million fewer people commuting in 2021 than in 2016. It has revealed COVID-19 altered commuting patterns for Canadian workers drastically. This comes as fewer workers were driving, taking transit, or walking and bicycling to work in 2021. But by May 2022, the number of car commuters was back to 2016 levels. Despite the recovery in vehicle traffic, transit levels were still lower in May 2022 than they were 6 years ago. While there may be fewer drivers on the roads, premiums are still going up in Ontario. The province has the highest private passenger auto insurance premiums in Canada. This is despite having one of the lowest rates of car crash injuries. That was one of the findings in the Ontario Auditor General's report released today. Bonnie Lissick noted average premiums were around $1,600 last year, which is a 14% increase compared to 2017. She found auto insurance rates vary widely across Ontario. The Auditor General says despite several recommendations over the past decade to improve Ontario's insurance framework, the Ministry of Finance has not done enough to lower costs. The first major snowstorm on British Columbia's south coast has arrived. It paralyzed traffic, cut power to thousands of homes, and shut down flights at Vancouver International Airport after a plane slid off a taxiway. The snow and freezing temperatures turned many Metro Vancouver roads and bridges into sheets of ice, which turned an hour-long commute into an hours-long commute. Utility crews worked through the night to restore power in many areas. This included hard-hit regions of Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands. On the other side of the country, parents and teachers in Nova Scotia say they have noticed a high number of children absences lately. Nova Scotia Teachers Union President Ryan Lutz says that teachers are reporting that their classrooms are between 40% and 50% empty in recent weeks. The class absences come as the province's hospitals deal with a surge of influenza, COVID-19, and respiratory syncytial virus. The rankings are in, and some of the country's biggest cities are getting a lower spot on a new environmental scorecard. The study was published in the journal Environment International. It rates 30 cities and towns on 9 indicators which are related to health, including air quality, heat and cold waves, ultraviolet radiation, access to green spaces, and other factors. Daniel Rainham is the study's senior author and a Dalhousie professor, and he says Canada's largest cities posted relatively low scores, but some of their neighborhoods scored on the higher end. Officials think a donation from a late Winnipeg businesswoman might be the largest individual donation to a Canadian charity in history. Miriam Bergen, who died earlier this year, has bequeathed the Winnipeg Foundation $500 million to help other people. Friends say the unassuming philanthropist found joy in simple, inexpensive hobbies, such as photographing the birds in her backyard. Stay with us. We'll be right back after a quick break. New data shows that an experimental Alzheimer's drug modestly slowed the brain disease's inevitable worsening. Japanese drug maker Eisai and its U.S. partner Biogen have said that lecanemab appears to work, and they've released their study's full results this week. Eisai says the drug's benefit translates to about a 5-month delay in progression over the 18-month study. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration is expected to decide whether to approve the drug by early January. Well, this comes as hopeful news to the millions of people worldwide suffering from the fatal disease. Joining us now to give us the latest information on the scope of the disease in Canada is Dr. Joshua Armstrong, research scientist with the Alzheimer Society of Canada. Dr. Armstrong, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you.
So, what do we know so far about lecanemab, how it works, and what this means to the Alzheimer Society of Canada?
This is a relatively new drug. It's a monoclonal antibody. It's been developed to try to address Alzheimer's disease in people who have either mild cognitive impairment or early stages of the dementia. What it happens is it happens to bind to proteins in the brain that come along with Alzheimer's disease called amyloid, and help the immune system take them out of the brain to hopefully improve the brain health and cognitive function of these older adults.
That sounds quite interesting, Dr. Armstrong. So, how is the Alzheimer Society of Canada reacting to this development?
It's somewhat exciting news to see a drug have some positive outcomes in a trial. We've seen failure after failure looking at drugs to treat Alzheimer's disease. To see a positive sign or some signal that there is possibility of addressing this condition is a good thing to see.
Promising to see as well, indeed, sir. Now, in terms of current treatments available in Canada for those with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, what do we know so far about that?
There are no current treatments that actually can address the progression of Alzheimer's disease. There are some drugs that might treat some symptoms, but nothing slows down the progression. So having this new drug, having some sign that it may slow down some of the progression is a positive sign.
It is a positive sign indeed, sir. Now, I want to jump to a recent study by the Alzheimer Society of Canada. It actually recommends actions that the Canadian government can take to reduce the risk of the disease developing in the country. So tell us a little bit more about the study and what realistic steps our officials can take about this disease.
Sure, this is the landmark study. We published the first report back in September, looking at projections of dementia in Canada over the next 30 years. So one of the things that the report found was if we were able to delay onset of dementia, we were actually to be able to avoid many, many people developing dementia in their lifetime in Canada. The idea would be if we could improve dementia risk reduction in Canada across the population, delaying the onset, we then be able to avoid dementia at a fairly high rate. This can be done through many things, mostly through addressing what are called modifiable risk factors, things that increase the risks of the disease in the population. We're able to better address those. We might be able to reduce the numbers of dementia that we see in Canada.
And how big of an impact would this make on the disease in Canada in terms of stats, in terms of kind of data that we have, if Canada were to implement these steps?
Well, there's a whole range of steps. So if we were able to delay the onset by just 1 year, we'd see a drop in almost 400,000 cases across Canada over the next 30 years. A 5-year delay in onset, we see that number increase even more drastically. And if we could push off the onset dementia in 10 years effectively across the whole population, we'd almost avoid over 4 million people developing dementia over the 30-year time period. These are very optimistic, and the idea is to be effective across the whole population. But if we could have a wide scale interventions where we could address brain health, address these modifiable risk factors, we could have a great impact across the country.
Some promising information there, Doctor. It looks like we've got about a minute left here. But in terms of the scope of the disease in Canada, what do we know so far about it? We mentioned worldwide information. At least 50 million people around the world, according to the UN, have this disease. But what about in Canada itself?
Currently, we're looking at about 660,000 people in Canada with dementia, with that number expected to increase fairly rapidly over the next 30 years due to the aging of the population. Baby boomers are getting in their late 70s, 80s, and 90s. And with age comes a greater risk of dementia. So as our population ages, we'll see more and more numbers, and more people affected by this brain condition.
We definitely need to see some action in this sector, Dr. Armstrong. Thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me. Cheers.
Stay with us. We will be right back. And after the break, we'll be taking a look at gender-based violence and what can be done to stop it. We'll be speaking with the chief of Ending Violence Against Women section at UN Women. This comes as the organization is calling gender-based violence the most widespread and pervasive human rights violation in the world. After that, we'll have top international news stories. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. During the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, UN Women is highlighting this type of violence as the most widespread and pervasive human rights violation in the world. The latest data on violence against women and girls indicates more than 5 women or girls are killed every hour by someone in their own family, according to UN Women. And Canada is no stranger to this issue. According to 2021 data from Statistics Canada, a woman is killed by her intimate partner approximately every 6 days. And over 4 in 10 Canadian women have experienced some form of intimate partner violence. Unfortunately, intimate partner violence isn't the only issue associated with gender-based violence overall. Well, joining us now to tell us more about this and what role we can play to put an end to gender-based violence in Canada and around the world is Ms. Kalliopi Mingeiro, Chief of the Ending Violence Against Women section at UN Women. Ms. Mingeiro, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
Now, this year's theme during the 16 days of activism is activism itself. So can you tell us a little bit more about this theme and how it compares to previous years?
Thank you. This year's theme really tries to focus on the role that women's rights organizations, feminist organizations play around the world in order to prevent violence against women and to respond to such violence. We have evidence around the world that such a role of women's rights organizations, it even reduces violence in the longer term because they do contribute to how they can change laws and policies and how they can activate a whole of society dialogue about the issue of violence against women and girls. But we do invite beyond the women's rights activists and women's rights, human rights defenders, we do invite the whole society, all of you, to become activists and to take a very active stand in order to end violence against women and girls now and for all.
I like that anyone can become an activist and make a difference in this issue, ma'am. Now, in terms of data, we know UN Women recently came out with a report on femicide itself. It found over 5 women and girls are killed every hour by intimate partners or family members. So what does this mean for the safety of women overall around the world, including inside their homes?
First of all, to remind you that when we talk about statistics and data, we have to remember that behind these numbers, there are real women and girls. There are real lives that they have been shattered just at one moment, forever. Their lives have been shattered forever. And you raised a very good point about what does it mean for their safety in their own homes, suffering from their own people that they have trusted and loved throughout their lives. I have to say that femicide is the most extreme form of violence manifested against women and girls. What we usually see, it's like different forms of violence already happening at home, domestic violence as we call it, or intimate partner violence, that it's getting escalated with the time and then it ends to femicide. So safety at home is a very precarious issue for many, many women around the world. And very often this is preventable. Because if the police has reacted to such calls of domestic violence early on, they had the proper risk assessment for the survivors, for the victims of such violence, such femicides could have been prevented in the first place.
Now, advocates here in Canada, they're shedding light on how society can dismiss such violence. And in this way, it could also come in subtle ways. So can you tell us a little bit more about how this happens?
You know, violence against women and girls is so normalized and it's considered very often a very trivial issue. And sometimes when we talk about violence against women, we bear in mind the very extreme forms, the physical abuse, the sexual assault, and the femicides, for example. When we have so many different forms of violence, like, for example, sexual harassment in the streets, sexual harassment in the workplaces, sexual harassment in schools, for example, and that the way it has been trivialized, that it's a phenomenon, that it's a part of life in everyday lives, it's really unacceptable.
Very unacceptable indeed, Ms. Mingeiro. We are out of time, but I do want to remind our viewers that they can play a role in ending violence in their homes, in their communities. They can be activists, just like Ms. Mingeiro just said. Ms. Mingeiro, thank you for this important conversation.
Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. And after the break, we're going to be taking a look at the major news stories and headlines from around the world, as Turkey says Finland and Sweden may be able to join NATO if they take more concrete steps. Bombers from Russia and China fly together in a joint patrol, and the Eurozone inflation falls to 10% in November. We'll have these stories and more from around the world up next. Stay with us. Well, it looks like Sweden and Finland have made some progress in meeting Turkey's security concerns, but they still need to undertake additional concrete steps to win Ankara's approval for their NATO bids. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says it's time to welcome them as full-fledged members of the alliance. Sweden and Finland abandoned their long-standing policies of military non-alignment, and they applied for membership in the alliance after Russian forces invaded Ukraine in February. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces are hoping to secure new air defenses from NATO. This came as the war-torn country's foreign minister says diplomats have pledged a number of new commitments on arming his nation. Dmytro Kuleba refused to confirm or deny whether NATO was planning to provide any U.S.-made Patriot missile batteries. Ukraine has been working to keep up with Russian bombardments on its electricity grid. Moving to the Western Pacific now, where Russian and Chinese bombers have flown a joint patrol. It is a show of the increasingly close defense ties between the two countries. Russia says the planes flew over the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea. China describes the patrols as a routine part of an annual cooperation plan. As the war continues in Ukraine, the European Union has announced that it plans to pursue a UN-backed investigation of possible war crimes committed by Russia. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says the EU will work with international partners for the tribunal. This while continuing to support the work of the International Criminal Court. Since the invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, Russia's military forces have been accused of a wide range of abuses. Well, amid rising public anger, China's ruling Communist Party has vowed to crack down on infiltration and sabotage activities by what it calls hostile forces. The statement was released on Tuesday night. This was after the largest street demonstrations in decades were staged in several cities. They were led by citizens fed up with strict anti-COVID-19 restrictions. There has been a massive show of force by the internal security services. Forces have conducted random ID checks and searched mobile phones for evidence of participation in demonstrations. An organization of 34 democratic countries says democracy is being degraded around the world. This is because people are losing faith in the legitimacy of elections and the imposition of restrictions on freedom of expression, among a range of issues. The International IDEA, a body founded to promote democracy, says half of the democratic governments around the world are on a decline. This comes as elected leaders face unprecedented challenges from Russia's war in Ukraine, cost of living crises, a looming global recession, and climate change. Meanwhile, inflation in the 19 countries that use the euro currency eased to 10% this month. This comes as fuel and utilities drifted down from painful highs. But it's still near the record levels that have robbed consumers of spending power and led economists to predict a recession. The European Union Statistics Agency said Wednesday that the consumer price index was down from 10.6% in October. That is the first decrease since June 2021. South of our border, the U.S. economy grew at a 2.9% annual rate in the third quarter. This comes despite high interest rates and chronic inflation. Today's report from the U.S. government shows that growth in the July-September period was led by solid gains in exports and consumer spending that was stronger than originally reported. The increase in gross domestic product followed 2 straight quarters of contraction. The humble French baguette is being inscribed on the UN's list of intangible heritage as a prized tradition that should be protected by humanity. UNESCO experts gathering in Morocco this week decided that the staple bread flute deserved UN recognition. The decision came after France's Culture Ministry warned of a continuous decline in the number of traditional bakeries and the closures of 400 bakeries a year over the past half-century. Other global cultural heritage items being inscribed include Japan's Furyu Odori, ritual dances, and Cuba's light rum masters. All right, well, back at home, Christmas came a little early for a charitable baker in Humboldt, Saskatchewan. Erica Rabinski founded Pastry and the Piano to help families in need, including the James Smith Cree Nation and children in Ukraine. And when her oven conked out, A-Line Furniture in Humboldt received a call from a buyer looking to remain anonymous. Ms. Rabinski says she thinks a group of people came together and purchased the oven for her, and she was totally moved. She calls the people who purchased the oven for her her Christmas angels. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could follow us on our website or social media. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.